Well, hello, everybody, and welcome. I'm Anna Harvey, president of the Social Science Research Council, and welcome to the College and University Fund Lecture Series for 2024. So this year, our lecture series is focused on the theme of research to solve problems. And we're interested in learning about what the research process might look like if we prioritize not only creating new knowledge and sharing that knowledge by producing peer-reviewed publications, which we already do, but also solving real-world problems. So would we do anything differently? And if so, what would we do differently? Would we be giving anything up? And if so, would it be worth it? And how would we know if we were succeeding? And I think another way of thinking about this question is to think about the amount of time and effort and resources that universities have invested in knowledge transfer in the science and engineering disciplines, where knowledge transfer means transferring scientific knowledge for commercial uses. But we don't have anything like that architecture, I think, on university campuses for transferring knowledge for non-commercial uses, including in the public sector. So last month, we welcomed Stefano Della Vigna from the University of California, Berkeley, one of the member institutions in the Council's College and University Fund for the Social Sciences. And Stefano talked about work that he has done with co-authors to follow up on every randomized controlled trial conducted by the Behavioral Insights team in North America that had been conducted in partnership with city governments. And Stefano and his co-authors asked whether the intervention being trialed had actually been adopted by city governments, and if so, the features that were associated with adoption. And their findings were striking and not predicted by academic experts, and in some ways kind of demoralizing. The strength of the evidence in support of interventions had essentially no impact on whether interventions were adopted. Instead, what mattered was whether an intervention was part of a pre-existing communication. And so the paper's findings suggest that we might want to take into consideration existing distribution channels, existing communication channels, if we want to see research adopted into policy. So today, I'm very happy to welcome Cyrus Samii, professor of politics, and I can't say my favorite colleague at New York University, one of my very favorite colleagues at New York University, also one of the member institutions in the Council's College and University Fund for Social Sciences. Cyrus served for several years as the executive director of EGAP. He's just stepping down, the Evidence in Governance and Politics Network, which consists of researchers and practitioners building an evidence base for more effective governance. Cyrus has written a provocative and challenging essay, which is entitled Methodologies for Political Science as Problem Solving, which he's going to share with us today. And I'm so glad he's joining us. So Cyrus is going to talk for, 40 minutes or so, and then we'll have time for Q&A. So at any point, feel free to put questions into the Q&A. And then when Cyrus wraps up, I'll field him your questions. All right, so Cyrus, thank you so much for being here today, and it's all yours.
Thank you so much, Anna, for the kind introduction, and thanks everybody for turning out today. I really appreciate it. I'm very excited to give this talk. The talk is entitled Political Science as Problem Solving, and I will be, making an argument about how we might orient political science, and also I think it applies to other social sciences research programs. These ideas are, written up in an essay that actually came upon the request of Janet Bock-Stevensmeyer, Valeria Sinclair Chapman, and Dino Christensen, who are co-editing a forthcoming handbook, methodological handbook. So I invite you all to check it out. There's some great contributions in there besides my own, and that'll be coming out via Oxford University Press any time now, sometime very soon. So I usually like to start by relaying a kind of story or anecdote that helps to convey some of the motivation of what I'm talking about. And the anecdote here has to do with an activity that occupies, quite a bit of my professional life, which is advising graduate students. And I had a graduate student come in and discuss with me some ideas that they had regarding research that they wanted to do for their dissertation. And the idea that the graduate student had was to study, reasons in countries that are going through potential democratic backsliding, that members of parties that are opposing those, who are responsible for an authoritarian turn, might become demotivated to continue their civic engagement, and thereby, in a sort of perverse way, contribute to the closing of democratic space. The idea that people who would be voting for parties that are trying to promote democracy might become discouraged, and then that contributes to the dynamic of democratic backsliding. That was the idea, and obviously this research question is one that's relevant in many contexts, including here in the United States. And the idea that the student had was that, well, shows of strength on the part of an incumbent or rising authoritarian, in a sense, could serve to discourage the opposition from turning out, right? And that this was a hypothesis that was embedded in a more elaborate theory, but this was kind of the core hypothesis. And so what the student was proposing to do was a survey experiment in which respondents would be randomly assigned to different vignettes. And in one of the vignettes, the respondent would be given indication of shows of strength by the rising authoritarian. And then the idea was to test whether this sort of vignette, this kind of information treatment, then resulted in the survey respondent indicating less enthusiasm about future civic participation. Okay. And so I advise the student not to do this project. In some senses, the project satisfies all of the characteristics that, a sort of disinterested reading of what we tend to value in contemporary social science would, hold as being like good, right? It was focusing on a big problem that was general and applicable to many settings. The hypothesis was motivated by, an interesting theory. So the hypothesis as it was fairly simple, but there was a more elaborate theory that surrounded it. And the research design was one that was going to use, randomization with a population-based sample to obtain credible causal identification on the population of interest. And so by all of these terms, it seems like this is good research. I disagreed. And the reason that I disagreed was because I didn't see this project as helping to address the problem that we're concerned about in this case. In fact, I saw this research as potentially exacerbating the very problem that we're trying to study. And so what I proposed was another research design that emphasized strategies to try to encourage opposition turnout in settings of democratic backsliding and encourage turnout to help to support parties that would be helping to push against democratic backsliding and to reorient the research program and think in those terms, rather than just trying to test this hypothesis in ways that could actually, in the real world, lead to harm, okay? And so that's an example of a conversation that I've had, but I've actually had numerous conversations like that over the years. And I finally got to a point where I decided that, I need to write some things down to help people, understand a point of view that I think is really important, which is about, thinking about your research as helping to improve our understanding of the nature and extent of problems that we think are meaningful, to understand the mechanisms that sustain those problems, and then to ultimately think about interventions that could help to mitigate those problems. What I'm proposing here is reacting to, specific instances like what I just described. I'm also reacting to some other things that, I observe. First, what I see as siloing and, some senseless jockeying for priority on the basis of methodological approaches. So discussions about whether, the emphasis should be, of what we're doing in terms of our research and our graduate training and so on should be emphasizing theory building versus whether, causal inference is what it's all about versus no, there should be priority for mere description versus no quantitative experiments, no, like what we're doing as political scientists is describing the world, no, what we're doing is normative. There are these kind of debates that are about jockeying for priority for these sorts of approaches that I don't think are necessary, right? And I'm going to articulate a framework that brings all of these things together in a meaningful way. And I do that because the way I do research myself and the way I teach and the way I think many people do also bring all of these things together. So there's no need for the jockeying for priority in the articles that we oftentimes see that contribute to this jockeying for priority. I also am trying to push back against what I see as a common theme in the academy, which is, to pursue research in a way that's about chasing irony. So another type of conversation that I oftentimes have is with somebody who's either doing a theoretical or empirical analysis, and what they see is like the ultimate victory is if they can discover, whether analytically, deductively, or some compelling empirical evidence for an ironic outcome. So unintended consequences of interventions that were intended to promote social welfare actually, turning out to be harmful in one way or another. And, the story sort of ends there. I see that as problematic as a goal. And then I also am responding to what I see as a sort of confusion over ethical foundations of different types of research. And I'm particularly sensitive to this, as Anna mentioned. I was previously the executive director of the Evidence and Governance and Politics Network. And what that network is about is really bringing researchers and practitioners together to think about testing different governance strategies, so strategies to improve accountability, delivery of public services, and so on, and to use experimentation to do that. That means intervening in people's lives in meaningful ways. And so, obviously one needs to proceed with some caution in doing that sort of work. But I've found, some of the debates regarding the ethics of that kind of research to be coming from vantage points that I don't think are particularly well informed or necessarily understanding what those who are involved in the EGAP network and similar types of endeavors are after. Okay, so this essay is trying to clarify some of those terms. So my proposal for addressing these issues, to provide a sort of guidance to the notional graduate student that I mentioned at the beginning, and to address these issues of siloing and jockeying and so on, is what I call a problem-solving approach. And I'm not the only person to have proposed this in the context of the social sciences more broadly. In fact, I'm building on what others have done. And actually, since this talk has been announced, I've received some really great emails pointing to others' contributions along these lines. So I'm really happy to see others thinking in similar ways. The problem-solving approach basically has you, conceive of a research agenda in terms of 3 stages. Okay, the first stage is addressing the question, what exactly is the problem here? And my use of the term problem is in terms of the common language use of the word problem. I mean it to refer to something that is wrong or troublesome in the world, okay? So I'm not just talking about, like a mathematical problem or what's more commonly discussed in, social science methodology, a quote unquote puzzle. I'm actually talking about problems, things that you find troublesome out there in the world. So what is the problem? That's the first step. Second step of a problem-solving oriented research program is then addressing the question, why does the problem, as defined, persist? What are the mechanisms that sustain or exacerbate the problem in the real world? What are our explanations for the problem? Okay. And then the last part is addressing the question, how can we mitigate the problem, right? So what are strategies that we might undertake to try to mitigate the problem, whether there's strategies in terms of dissemination of information, whether there's strategies in terms of institutional design, what are the strategies we might undertake to mitigate the problem? And my thinking here is, inspired by a terrific essay, and in fact, I think it was sort of address that Don Moynihan issued upon receipt of an award recently, that itself drew upon the work of Herbert Simon to think about social science as a study of institutional design. And I emphasize design. What we're trying to do is, in Simon's words, to appreciate, the artifice of our institutions and the human element that's there in defining, the social and institutional environment in which we live, and the fact that all these things are products of our imagination and our interpretation of the world. And so we're scholars of that. We're not, as social scientists, we're not scholars of processes that operate beyond our imagination and our own making. We are scholars of processes that unfold on the basis of institutions that we put in place. And so there's an active element to it that I think is different than what we might call the hard sciences, where they're, sort of observing things and dynamics that have been set in motion by processes that are sort of like outside our own making. And so, this idea of our focus of research being one about design has a number of implications. I think it implies that the potential for accumulation of social science knowledge is very limited, and the aims in that regard should be very different from the natural sciences, right? What we, emphasize at any given moment in time refers to concepts and innovations that are relevant to that point in time, but that may cease to be relevant at some point in the future, and we should be comfortable with that. So what's the rationale for proposing that we orient research programs toward problem solving, where problems are defined in terms of things that we find troublesome out there in the world? First, I think that as social scientists, we develop the methodological and substantive expertise for problem conceptualization, problem diagnosis, strategy design, and strategy testing. These ideas draw from a terrific essay that Esther Duflo wrote, in which she discussed the idea of economists as plumbers, people who are, operating in a pragmatic manner to try and fix problems in reality. And then if you want to think about this from a more epistemological perspective, Duncan Watts has a nice essay where he's making similar arguments as I'm making here, but for him, the consideration is that a problem-solving approach helps to keep researchers close to reality, and that helps to establish common terms for gauging progress. So we're not just, building, castles that are self-referential and siloed in terms of, conceptual frameworks, but rather we're trying to do work, theoretical work and empirical work that is then connected to attempts to make progress on things that people can commonly witness and evaluate in the real world. Okay, so what are the steps in the problem-solving research program? As I mentioned, first step is what is the problem here, right? Where, again, problem understood in the common language sense as something that is troublesome in the world, okay? So the first step here involves two types of analysis. The first type of analysis is what I would call normative theoretical analysis, right? And that means that, you're working to establish why a particular fact pattern that you might measure is troubling in principle, okay? And so this is bringing in normative frameworks that, in political science departments, our colleagues who work on political theory and political philosophy are endeavoring, sometimes, not all the time, but, many of them are endeavoring to elaborate, right? And then, insofar as one establishes, on the basis of a compelling normative argument that a particular fact pattern is troubling, in principle, then the next component of this is descriptive empirical analysis to establish whether and to what extent such troubling fact patterns exist in actuality, okay? You're going to see throughout all three of these stages, I'm going to talk about how there's a theory component and there's an empirical component, and these two things always work together in a manner, such that they each serve to refine the other, okay? The second step in a problem-solving research program is the analysis of why problems persist, okay? And here, again, we have this interplay between the theoretical analysis and the empirical analysis, okay? So whereas in step one, the theoretical analysis was normative, right? Establishing what fact patterns, are troublesome and why, under what normative framework that might be the case. At this stage, we're engaging in positive theoretical analysis. And what we're trying to do is to elaborate the mechanisms that might explain the problem in principle. And so if you think about what colleagues in your department who work on positive theory are up to, one could think about them as developing tools and results to allow us to characterize mechanisms, whether they're mechanisms that pertain to strategic interaction, whether they're mechanisms that pertain to behavioral tendencies. These are mechanisms that explain, why certain problems might exist in principle, right? Those theoretical analyses give rise to hypotheses and observable implications that we could then try to take to data to try to see whether the explanations that they're offering are compelling, right? And so the work that's done here to complement the positive theoretical analysis is what I call observational causal empirical analysis, where we're trying to explore whether the mechanisms that are proposed under the different theories are in fact operating out in the world, okay? So what mechanisms appear to perpetuate the problem in actuality, okay? And you'll note that I describe this type of empirical analysis as observational causal. Here we're in the diagnosis stage, right? So we want to see how things are playing out, right? Now, we might use certain tools that help us to reveal things that are difficult to observe naturally. So we might use things like survey experiments, for example, to try and reveal tendencies that are operating in the world. But I don't think we want to confuse those types of experimental analyses that are really meant to try to understand mechanisms that are operating in the natural world with other types of experiments that are genuinely about trying to test interventions. And when we go back to the example that I gave of the student, you could think of what that student was trying to do was actually to design an experiment that didn't have, any interest in trying to test a strategy for mitigating the problem, but rather to design an experiment that sought to understand the mechanisms that might be perpetuating a problem. And in those terms, that type of analysis falls squarely into this. I do think, however, that when we're thinking about designing experiments and thinking about intervening in the real world, we do have to consider, what we're introducing and the potential harms that might be there, right? And so just because you're potentially contributing to this type of observational causal empirical analysis, to me, it doesn't mean that anything goes. I think that, there have to be some safeguards that are put in place such that we don't have people going out and, introducing harm in the world, with the excuse that what they're trying to do is to better diagnose a problem. I think that, we have to judge those types of exercises in terms of the trade-offs that are present. So it might be that an observational analysis that doesn't, introduce factors that could cause harm might be more compromised in terms of, let's say, causal identification or empirical precision, but that they're done in ways that are considerate of the fact that, we don't want to exacerbate the problem that we're trying to understand better, okay? And so I think a lot of the discussion about the ethics of experimentation falls into this realm, okay? What bothers me, and I'll get to the next point, is when those sorts of arguments are then carried into assessments of what are, in fact, deliberate and well-considered intervention based analyses. Okay. Now, moving to the third part of this way of thinking about research programs, we move to the phase of how we might mitigate the problem. Okay, and again, you're going to see this interaction between theoretical analysis and empirical analysis. And so these two things, they go hand in hand all the way through, okay? And so now we are using positive theoretical analysis that's motivated by normative principles that were established in the problem definition phase, right? To think about what intervention strategies might mitigate the problem that we're addressing in principle, right? And so it could be that, in the diagnosis stage, the previous stage, when we were trying to understand the mechanisms that perpetuate or exacerbate the problem, we came up with a model that, managed to make sense of a lot of the observational data, that, could then lead us into this stage of thinking about, okay, well, how might the circumstances that the model captures be modified so as to mitigate the problem. I think a great example of this is Ostrom's, Governing the Commons, where she does a sort of, she does an analysis of common pool problems that, works with, at the time, canonical models of collective action failure, right? And proposes a strategy through which a sort of mutual agreement and enforcement mechanism might be layered on top of that strategic dynamic to overcome the collective action problem, right? And so this is a great example of where you have, one model that serves to characterize issues that perpetuate a problem, and then, you look at layering on top of that some new stage in the game in that case, and new exogenously introduced resources that then help to, mitigate the problem that the original model was highlighting. I think that's a classic example of this type of theoretical work. And so what was proposed there was a strategy that in principle might help to mitigate the collective action problem. then, what we're doing here is oftentimes proposing new types of information or new institutional interventions that don't as yet exist in the world, okay? And so it's not straightforward that we would be able to test, whether those strategies work in actuality without actually going to the trouble of designing an experiment or some sort of intervention-based research design to, in fact, introduce that novel information or those novel institutional, interventions, parameters into the world to test it, okay? And so this is where I think many people who are thinking about experiments and thinking about methodology, but only thinking in terms of explanation, sometimes get tripped up, okay? In thinking that, well, as long as we can get decent identification strategies, all social science could be done in an observational manner. There's no need necessarily for RCTs, or there's nothing particularly valuable about RCTs. What RCTs are as trials, right, are oftentimes about introducing some sort of novel variation in the world that is like a product of our imagination. It's not something that exists in the world as it is, right? And so in those respects, it seems absolutely necessary that we maintain RCTs in the social science toolkit, because otherwise, the only things we can do are to, simulate hypothetical interventions that depend very crucially on, assumptions that are oftentimes difficult to defend. And so if we want to study how intervention strategies, novel intervention strategies, work in actuality, I mean, it seems really important that we maintain RCTs as a strategy for doing that, because we're studying something that's not being generated, under organic circumstances as it is. So the principles of the problem-based approach then are that the starting point of a problem-solving research program is in defining a real-world problem that you find compelling. And then the ending point is toward a set of intervention strategies. I feel like it's very clarifying when you think about the research that you're doing at any given point in time as being somewhere, within these two endpoints, right? It helps to give some direction. Theories, descriptive evidence, causal evidence, these things are all interacting with each other along the way, right? And so there's continual feedback between theory and empirics throughout all stages. Normative theory interacting with descriptive empirics, positive theory interacting with explanation and examination of mechanisms empirically, normative and positive theory interacting with strategies to test interventions. Some illustrations from my own research. I've been working on strategies to improve access to education in Afghanistan for some time now. I view this research that I'm doing as contributing to the literatures on state building and the extension of state capacity and capacities for providing publicly financed goods, in particular basic services like education and health. And the way that the research that I've done there in collaboration with Dana Birdie, Joel Middleton, and others is to begin by doing diagnostic analyses. And so what we were doing at the time was trying to understand the challenges that the government was facing in absorbing schools that were initially set up by non-governmental organizations and that were ostensibly to be handed over to the government for their administration, right? There was, anecdotal evidence to suggest that that kind of handover was not going very well. We wanted to understand it more systematically and to try and understand what the problems were that were behind it. And so the problem here was that there was this failed handover of schools from NGOs to government administration. And so there was some failure, some organizational failure that was taking place. And again, we thought that this spoke to the literature and theories of state capacity and state building, but it had a very practical aspect to it as well. We did large-scale descriptive analysis just to understand the rates at which these handover failures occurred. They actually occurred at an astonishingly high rate in about in 76% of the villages in which we surveyed descriptively. We documented that such failed handover occurred, such that the schools that the NGOs were running closed up and no government substitute was put in place within the 3 years after the NGO schools closed up. And so that was a very sobering measure of the extent of the problem. We then, undertook, a series of studies that involved various types of qualitative and quantitative research, even experimental research, to try and understand what the barriers were. And that led us, on the basis of theories of decentralization and accumulated evidence on community-directed development strategies, to propose a strategy that could help to ensure a more seamless handover. And then we designed an RCT to test this strategy, and obtained fairly compelling evidence that this looked promising. And so that was the full arc of the research program. It was always driven by wanting to address this problem of needing to sustain access to education in remote Afghan communities, and understanding it as an instance of the problem of trying to extend state capacity in places in particular that had been affected by war. I can also point to illustrations in my own teaching. So I teach an undergraduate seminar that's built on this model of problem-solving oriented research. And so the seminar is about, it's called Diversity in Society, but it's basically about underrepresentation in positions of authority, where underrepresentation can be defined along various sort of group-based identity lines. So whether we're talking about class, whether we're talking about ethnic or gender-based identities, minority status, there are different ways that the students think about underrepresentation, right? They then work over the course of the semester on a particular version of this problem. So they choose a form of underrepresentation in an institutional setting that they find interesting. So it could mean underrepresentation in the National Assembly. It could also mean underrepresentation in various parts of the private sector that amount to being positions of authority. So, for example, partner level at law firms in the United States. That was one project that students worked on last year. Was underrepresentation of women at the partner level in law firms in the United States. So that's the way that problems are characterized. We start with the normative analysis. So the first thing that they read in the class, for example, is Mansbridge's normative analysis of descriptive representation. I want people to have like a proper analytical grounding on the motivation for their problem definition before they start embarking on doing the empirical analysis. And then they go through all of the phases over the course of the semester, where they do an empirical analysis to characterize the nature and the extent of the problem. They do observational causal analyses to understand why the problem persists. And then they end with deriving implications on the basis of the evidence and theory on strategies for mitigation. Various criticisms I've heard about this approach. They have a similar flavor oftentimes, where people might react to say, well, as social scientists, it's not our place to define problems for people and to much less to promote or advocate for solutions. That's just not our place. It's anti-democratic to try to circumvent public deliberation about problem definitions, much less solutions, by somehow claiming expertise over these matters. What do we know better than other people in society? Our job is to explain, not to propose. We're scientists, not activists. Anyway, it's foolhardy to think that these problems, that we study could be solved, quote unquote. Whether something is a problem at all, it's subjective. And so that's not a reasonable basis for a scientific research program. And really, priority in the academy should go toward, quote unquote, basic research, okay? I mean, I think in my, mention of what I consider to be the rationale for social scientists working in a problem-solving manner, I address these criticisms, right? I talked about how I do think we're actually accumulating relevant expertise, right? And I do think that on that basis, our voice is not just one, in the crowd necessarily. I think our voice is one, that can offer some clarity, insight, and suggestions to help to improve this type of public deliberation. And we don't have to shy away from that. In fact, I would say that the public probably expects it from us. And to the extent that we shy away from it, you could say that we're shirking on the basis of the investments that society is making in us to develop this expertise. So, we're not seeking to short circuit democracy, but rather to contribute to deliberation by offering, constructive analyses and suggestions on the basis of the expertise that we have the opportunity to cultivate that others who are doing other things don't. So to conclude, I think that the problem-solving approach offers a way to get past the type of siloing and jockeying that I mentioned at the beginning. It helps us to establish common terms for progress by keeping the research close to the real world. And I think it helps to establish terms for evaluating research ethics. So you notice, if you remember my discussion about experimentation in the context of trying to understand mechanisms. The approach involves 3 phases: defining problems in theory and in actuality, diagnosing problems and explaining why they persist in theory and in actuality, and then defining and testing strategies in theory and in actuality. Okay, so theory and empirics always interact. And then I guess I'll close here by saying that I think that federal funding agencies for the social sciences and the NSF in particular should really abandon exclusive priority for what they consider to be, or what they call basic research, and instead fund problem-solving research programs. I think in the social sciences, as I mentioned, inspired by Simon, insofar as what we study are the artifices that are the products of human imagination, and that we're always trying to improve on those institutions and the information environments that we are creating as humans. The idea that you can do basic research that's somehow not part of trying to contribute or inform that type of innovation. I mean, I just don't think it makes sense for the social sciences. I mean, maybe for the natural sciences, I can understand the distinction between understanding fundamental physics and trying to create new plastics for industrial applications. But I don't think that distinction makes a lot of sense for the social sciences, especially political science. And that being the case, insofar as we want to have social science programs funded by our national funding agencies, they should appreciate that there are differences and that we should therefore be funding problem-solving research programs. So I'll end it there, and I look forward to Q&A.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Cyrus. And I actually have, I don't think so. So we have a bunch of questions, which I will field to you. I'm going to, exercise my privilege of asking the first question. And I think I wouldn't call it a criticism, but I think it's a question, at least, that's not on your slide of, here's the feedback I've gotten so far. And it's a question that I think takes your approach on its own terms and says, okay, well, so the research process, right? And the practices that support the research process on university campuses, including graduate training, are, in your language, institutions that have been designed by human imagination, our imagination, and can be altered by human imagination. So it's an example, right, of your kind of setting. And I think at some level, you're talking about what you see as a problem or a set of problems in the operation of these institutions, and you're proposing a solution, right? So you're right. And my question is really about, okay, well, so taking your approach on its own terms, one thing that I didn't really hear you talk about was thinking about, is this really going to work? Like, what's the empirical evidence for thinking that these stages will actually get us closer to achieving your goals? Or I think there's also an implicit underlying goal, which is to actually see evidence-based solutions adopted into policy and see reduction in the incidence of these problems in the world. And one reason that I'm asking the question is because I think we've seen, in your stages, your 3 stages, when I was reading the essay, the sort of partnership with implementing organizations, whether policy organizations or NGOs or firms, that happens at the very end, right? You start with normative theory and then move to positive theory and observation, and then you only talk to the partners at the end. And I think we've seen some papers come out in the last 3-4 years that suggest that, that oftentimes doesn't work because we need the partners involved in the very beginning and helping to define the questions and co-designing the solutions. And I'm sure in your work with EGAP, you've seen this. So I guess that was my, where's the empirical approach to thinking about your solution to this set of problems?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, the problems that I mentioned that this approach or this strategy, this intervention, I guess, is trying to address, include siloing and jockeying for priority, this tendency to chase irony that I find, and then what I think to be confusion over ethical foundations. And so the question is like, okay, well, to what extent can the intervention that I'm proposing, which is that people orient themselves toward problem-solving research, like to what extent will it resolve these? I mean, I guess when we think about wanting to test an intervention, this is getting very meta, right?
Yes, it is.
Yeah, I mean, one wants to think about like what is a test, that we could set up here, right? And so I guess one of the tests that we might set up here doesn't resemble the type of tests that we do in social science all the time, but it would be more like, having, to the extent that people find the argument that I'm making compelling, such that when they read, one of these other essays that's out there that's trying to jockey for the priority of one type of method versus another, the way that they interpret those arguments is that they're sort of missing, the forest for the trees, so that they'll evaluate, those articles or those arguments as being narrow, and that actually, they'll be comfortable with recognizing the value of the variety of methodological approaches that are out there and see use for that. So, I mean, I'm just hoping to impress upon people, like a way of just like valuing, what our different colleagues are doing. And so if I can persuade people that that's the case, then I think we're making progress, right? If we can get research that, helps to, bring people working in potentially different methodological traditions together and make progress in addressing problems, like if this creates like a foundation through which people can do that, then I would view that as progress as well, right? And so I guess the way I would judge progress empirically would be in those sorts of terms. Whether we want to set up some sort of experiment to do this with graduate students, I think could be really interesting. What you mentioned with regard to partnerships with implementing organizations, it's a great point. So EGAP, I think what distinguishes EGAP from many other social science professional organizations is the fact that the academics and the practitioners are like have equal standing and participate regularly in all of the activities. And so, a lot of the discussions, and the reason for that, again, is because we're talking about testing interventions in the real world. And a lot of the discussions that happen, so while we focus mostly on the design of RCTs and interpretation of RCTs, like those RCTs obviously come like far along in this problem solving, far along in the stages that I described. They're way after the problem definition stage and stuff like that. Nevertheless, like many of the discussions that come up when thinking about research design intervention strategies are, do you have, are you really characterizing the problem properly? And practitioners, having practitioners there to comment on intervention strategies and research designs like that and be in dialogue. I mean, it works both ways, right? Like sometimes the practitioners will come in with a suggestion for what they want to do, and the academics will be like, well, if you think about this in a more analytically precise way, it's not clear that this makes sense, and vice versa. If you think about this in a way that's more grounded in reality, what you're proposing to, and so we do go back, you know what I mean, and rethink whether we have the problem definition correct in those discussions. And I think having more of those forums would be really valuable.
Yeah. No, I agree. And I would just note that, for our science and engineering disciplines, there are entire architectures of university offices that are designed to foster, partnerships with industry, and it would be helpful to have more of those, right? Like the EGAP architecture, but more on our university campuses.
For sure.
All right. So here's a question which I also had, which is about how does your approach apply to doing more retrospective work? Because particularly say in criminal justice, we're not always able, we're often not able to do prospective RCTs because of concerns about randomizing treatment of people who are, in custodial settings. And here's a question about, if you want to look at something like a pass get out the vote campaign, how does your approach kind of, do you get stuck in the middle of your framework because you can't do the third stage, or how do you think about that?
Yeah, what's funny is that when I was originally asked to write this, Jan Bach-Sevensmeyer said, it'd be really interesting if you could like write something that helps people to understand the differences between observational research and experimental research and the questions that they try to answer. Okay. And I gave that some thought, and I decided that I didn't think that was necessarily the right way to break things down. I thought that the relevant difference was whether you're doing research that's trying to understand, sort of like organic processes and like diagnose mechanisms that perpetuate a problem. And so one could call that observational research, however, in a different way that's oftentimes understood in distinguishing it from experimental research. Because, like I said, you could use survey experiments and things like that to just try and understand mechanisms as they're playing out in the world organically, right? That's one side. Then the other side is interventionist research. Research is on intervention. So we're really thinking about something novel that's being introduced, right? And trying to understand how, the introduction of that novelty plays out in the real world. That can be experimental, like RCT, and there are a lot of reasons to value that, or, it could be retrospective. Yeah. But I think it's a difference in the way that one is understanding what one is doing, right? Or it could be a retrospective observational study that's trying to understand like how, the introduction of a given novel intervention played out in the world. And so that's interventionist research. I think that is different than research that's trying to explain, why certain problems persist, right? And so that's the way I see the difference. So some of those retrospective studies would actually, insofar as you arrive at a place you're like, oh, I think that, this type of strategy might make sense. Let me actually consult to see if this has ever been done before. Oh, wow, look at this. I didn't know that, but in so-and-so place, this was actually tried. Let's see, what happened, right? That would be, sort of part of the analysis of how we can mitigate the problem. It would be great if it could then inform like further prospective research, but I understand that that's not always possible. And it could be that the retrospective research is quite compelling in terms of informing policy as well.
Great. There's actually for those of you who are interested in this, is a great article. It's called, I think, Methods Matter. It came out in the AER maybe a couple years ago, but it was about looking at quasi-experimental methods relative to RCT methods. It was particularly looking at, the distribution of test statistics under different kinds of methods, and looking, to see, do we get a spike where we shouldn't see spikes, like right above, 1.96. We see like a lot of studies right there. Like if we do, that suggests that method is through some unseen mechanism being manipulated, or is more easily manipulated. And it turns out that, things like RDDs or, discontinuity designs are no different, are as good as RCTs in terms of having nice smooth curves, and even difference designs, once you control for journal quality and field, had a similar. So I do think that I think because we're getting better at those kinds of quasi-experimental designs, they're becoming, I think, as reliable. So here's a couple of questions about the role of theory. So in your framework, it is kind of like a theory comes first it's normative theory, and then maybe it's positive theory, and then you kind of get to but does it work in practice? And a couple of questions are both sort of aimed at, is that really, where does theory come from? So is it the case that really theory is sort of informed by the, like the stage 3, stage 2, and stage 3 sorts, even stage 3, like explicitly. And I actually read Esther Duflo's essay as kind of saying, start with stage 3 and build your theories out of, like your stage 3 sort of, tinkering with the pipes work, because you learn behavioral insights. So just a question about how do you really see it as like this one-way pathway from theory to then later empirical evidence?
We go back, and you have to go back and forth all the time, right? I have an example, so research that I was doing with some colleagues on utilization and payments for public services. In this case, it was different contexts. It was in the DRC, and that's a great example to me, where we had a sort of informal understanding of the problem there. So the problem there was basically low utilization of public services in a manner that seemed kind of problematic and puzzling in terms of the efficiency of public service provision. We had, some informal thoughts about what might be going on, and we, wrote out like a formal theory to sort of characterize that, and use that to then motivate a descriptive analysis and the design of an RCT. We then collected the descriptive data and looked at the descriptive data, and things just looked way different than what the theory suggested should be happening. What our theory was predicated on was this idea that people were shying away from predation by street level bureaucrats, and so a lot of what was going on here was about people sort of trying to shy away or hide themselves from potential predation exploitation. But the descriptive analysis that we did suggested that things were much different. It wasn't really about that at all. It was about people, not necessarily having the relevant endowments to be able to approach and engage with publicly provided services in an effective manner. And so that just completely transformed our analysis, and actually transformed the way we thought about the intervention that we were putting together. And so, and then we, wrote on the basis of the descriptive analysis, wrote a new theory. And so, I think it's good to pin down some ideas insofar as those ideas seem out of whack with what you observe empirically. Then, you have to iterate back and forth for sure. So whether you start with observation and, think about deriving inductively theory on that basis, or vice versa, they're always going back and forth. Yeah, so I don't mean for it to be this kind of linear process. Yeah.
No, I didn't think you did. So, and one final question, which is about the student here who's a political philosophy student, and is, I think, asking, can you think about the same problem-solving approach kind of within political philosophy, or is what you're suggesting that we integrate political philosophy into empirical social science? I guess it's kind of a question about how we train and think about graduate students in political philosophy.
Yeah, I'm not an expert in political philosophy. I read what I read in a very kind of functional manner, as it relates to the research that I'm doing. I do think so. There are certain lines of inquiry in political philosophy and normative political theory that are extremely relevant to what what we want to do as empirical social scientists. And I would love to see more consideration of those connections. So like I said in my class, I have them read the Mansbridge essay because I think it's really on the money in terms of characterizing, what's at stake over debates on descriptive representation. And it's just an extremely thoughtful consideration of the various concepts and how we might interpret different fact patterns and things that are out there, that I feel like, without having that sort of foundation, one could pursue questions of descriptive representation in a really naive manner. And so I think that type of political philosophy, political theorizing is extremely relevant to what we do. I don't know that it's necessarily like the modal, type of work that our colleagues who are working on political philosophy are doing. And insofar as there's not as much of that being generated, as there may have been in previous times, maybe it's not as, popular these days. I think that's a shame, because I do think, and it, part of the reason that might have happened is because, the cross-fertilization wasn't happening that much, and so it wasn't generating the enthusiasm. But I think that, it would be great to see more of that type of work being done that intentionally seeks to inform, what we're doing empirically, in a manner that, is organized under this problem-solving approach. I'd love to see that.
Yeah, same. All right, so we have more questions here that we don't have time to get to, but we're going to send Cyrus all of the chat so he gets a copy of it. Thank you, Cyrus, for coming and sharing this with us, and thank you everybody for attending. It was such a pleasure to have you.
Thank you very much. Really appreciate it. And thanks everybody for coming out. Apologies that I couldn't get to all of the questions, but happy to be in touch with people, offline.
Great. Thanks everybody. Take care.
Thank you.